A few years ago, I visited a church that was incredibly active. Their calendar was full, their programs were polished, their volunteers were busy every week. From the outside, everything looked strong. But when I spent time with the leaders, I sensed something different. They were exhausted, they were discouraged, they were quietly frustrated. One elder said something that stayed with me. We're doing everything we know to do, but something feels spiritually dry. Later that afternoon, I walked outside the building and noticed a large tree near the parking lot. From a distance, it looked healthy. But up close, the leaves were thinning, the branches were brittle, the soil around it was hard and cracked. It wasn't dying because of what was happening above ground. It was dying because what wasn't happening below ground. The roots weren't being nourished. And it struck me. Many leadership problems aren't strategy problems, they're root problems. You can't fix a root problem with better scheduling. You can't fix it with sharper branding. You can't fix it with more activity. If the roots aren't healthy, the tree will eventually show it. That realization reshaped how I think about leadership development. Before leaders go outward in mission, before they refine strategy, before they multiply activity, they must be formed at the roots. Upward in prayer, inward in scripture, outward in witness. Because sustainable mission doesn't grow from busyness, it grows from deep spiritual alignment. Welcome, my name is Samuel, and I want to help you with how to develop missional leaders through spiritual discipline, upward, inward, and outward. Today, I want to present a simple, reproducible framework for developing missional leadership through spiritual discipline. Over time in ministry, I've come to recognize something important. Most leadership challenges are not primarily strategic problems, they are formation problems. Leaders are often trained in systems, planning, organization, and execution, but they are not always deeply formed spiritually. As a result, leadership becomes activity-driven rather than spiritually grounded. Churches become busy, but they are not always aligned with God's mission. That conviction shaped this project. The purpose of this video is to present a clear, step-by-step model for developing missional leaders through three foundational disciplines: upward in prayer, inward in scripture reading, outward in witnessing to others. Rather than approaching leadership development as an organizational strategy alone, this model reframes leadership formation as a spiritual alignment. My goal is not just to inspire you, my goal is to give you a framework you can implement immediately within your ministry context. By the end of this session, you should know exactly how to cultivate upward dependence, inward conviction, outward engagement. Let's begin. Step number one, upward. Developing dependence through prayer. Missional leadership begins with communion before commission. In Luke chapter 5, verse 16, we see that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. Before choosing the 12 disciples, Luke chapter 6, verse 12 tells us he spent the night in prayer. Before the early church advanced in missions, Acts chapter 1, verse 14 tells us they devoted themselves to prayer. See, the pattern is clear. Before movement outward, there was surrender upward. The leadership implication is this: prayer trains leaders in dependence and on dependence in God. Psalm 127 verse 1 reminds us, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it in labor in vain. Without upward alignment, mission becomes personal ambition. So how do we move prayer from concept to practice? Here are practical steps. First, establish consistent daily prayer rhythms. Not occasionally prayer, but consistent prayer. Second, begin leadership meetings with intentional intercession, not rushed transition prayers. Third, create prayer lists for lost individuals. Remember, Acts chapter 4, verse 31 shows us that the early church praying for boldness before proclamation. Fourth, publicly model dependence on God in decision making. See, when leaders see visible dependent on God, it shapes the culture of the church. Upward alignment ensures that mission remains God's work and not ours. Step number 2, inward. Building conviction through Scripture. If prayer forms dependence, Scripture forms conviction. Leaders must be shaped by the word before shaping others. See, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, teaches that Scripture equips the servant of God for every good work. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, emphasized meditations on the word as the foundation for courage and faithfulness. And in Psalm chapter 1, described the stability of the person who delights in God's law. He's like a tree planted by streams of water. Here is the leadership implication. Without inward formation, leaders drift. Conviction rooted in Scripture produces sustainable leadership. So how do we build this inward formation? First, teach leaders how to study Scripture using 3 basic steps. Observation, what does the text say? Interpretation, what does it mean? Application, how does it apply? Second, establish structured weekly Scripture engagement for your leadership team. Third, encourage memorization of key passages that shape leadership identity. Fourth, allow biblical principles to guide ministry decisions, not trends, not pressure, not cultural expectations. Inward formation guards against theological instability and cultural drift. Conviction built on Scripture creates clarity in missions. Step number 3, outward. Cultivating courage through witnessing spiritual formation must overflow into proclamation. You see, in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19 and 20, Jesus commands us to make disciples of all nations. And in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, he declares that the Spirit empowers believers to be witnesses of Christ. Missions is not an option extension of leadership. It's central to it. Remember, Romans chapter 1, verse 16 reminds us that the gospel is the power of God for salvation. The leadership implication is simple. If spiritual discipline never move outward, they become private, spiritually detached from mission. So the question is, how do we cultivate outward engagement? First, establish personal evangelism accountability among leaders. Second, model gospel conversations yourself as a leader. Third, share testimony publicly within your congregation. Fourth, train teams to articulate the gospel clearly and confidently. Outward engagement builds courage, it builds compassion, and it prevents spiritual formation from becoming isolated. Upward produces dependence, inward producing conviction, and outward produces courage. So how do we integrate the theological logic of this structure? The structure of this framework follows a deliberate progression. God, Word, World. Upward, inward, outward. Communion precedes conviction, and conviction precedes commission. Each section follows the same instructional pattern: biblical foundation, leadership implication, and practical implementation. This repetition ensures clarity and reproducibility. When one dimension is neglected, imbalance are the results. Outward without upward leads to burnout. Inward without outward leads to stagnation. Upward without inward leads to theological shallowness. But when all 3 are integrated, leadership becomes sustainable. Missional leadership is not sustained by activity alone. It's sustained by alignment. Aligned upward with God, aligned inward with His Word, aligned outward towards the world. In conclusion, this project was designed to present a clear, practical, and reproducible model. It moves beyond theory, it provides a step-to-step implementation, and it could be replicated in any ministry context. Missional leadership develops when leaders depend deeply in God, stand firmly in Scripture, and move courageously into mission. Upward builds dependence, inward builds conviction, and outward builds courage. This is how we develop spiritually formed and missionally engaged leaders, and that is how missional leadership is sustained, not by busyness, but by alignment.